Hey, watch it, new guy. New guy. Haha, my market share can beat up your market share. Well, I'm still better in gaming. Well, we'll see about that. Oh, hey. Hey guys, welcome to Elevated Systems. I'm your host CJ. In the video I posted just a couple weeks ago, I built this $750 Intel-based gaming PC. You can check that video out right here. Now, overall this video was pretty well received. However, despite, in my totally non-biased opinion, being one of my best produced videos, it got the most number of dislikes. But I get it. A lot of people out there just don't believe that in early 2020 an Intel CPU or any 4-core CPU should be an option in a new desktop build. And then there are just the AMD fanboys who didn't even watch the video and just saw Intel in the title and hit dislike. That's a whole different thing that doesn't make sense to me, but I fully expected. So, what's my response? Well, analytics, naturally. I'm going to pull out the Intel Core i3-9100F and replace it with this Ryzen 5 1600.
The Ryzen 5 1600AF, as it's been dubbed, is not the original first-gen 14nm Ryzen 5 1600. It's a new CPU using the 12nm Zen Plus or Ryzen 2000 architecture. It is in fact a Ryzen 5 2600 with the base and boost clocks turned down 200 and 300 MHz respectively, as well as the price reduced to $85 US and labeled with the first gen name. It's a 6-core 12-thread CPU with a 3.2 GHz base and 3.6 GHz precision boost clock. The processor can be identified by the part number or box code YD1600BBAF, as opposed to ending with AE like the original part. Additionally, like the 2600, the 1600AF includes the Wraith Stealth Cooler, not the Wraith Spire, which shipped with the original 1600AE CPU.
Look, I don't have any special affinity to any particular brand. I don't care what it says here. I care how it performs in here, based on the price I paid for it. These are both $80 CPUs. So, will Ryzen with its 6 multi-threaded cores outperform the i3 with its higher clock speeds and IPC? Let's find out. Alright, the swap out is complete. Now, the only two components I changed in the system were the CPU and motherboard. All the other components stayed the same. Same memory, same drives, same GPU. The motherboard I'm using is the ASRock Fatality Gaming ITX AC because despite the form factor being different, the ASRock is the closest AM4 board in terms of features and power delivery to the Gigabyte B365 Intel board that I have. So now I'm going to run the same benchmarks I ran on the Intel system, but I'm going to run them twice. Once at base, out of the box settings, and then I'm going to overclock the CPU and run them again because, well, the Ryzen chip is unlocked, which is one of the big selling points for AMD over Intel. All their SKUs are overclockable. So let's get to it. Okay, This is the point where I was going to start rolling the benchmark charts, which I am, but I wanted to fill you in what I've been doing over the last week, which is actually how much time passed between that quick fade out and fade back in. Half a second for you, 7 days for me. So 3 things to highlight. First, when I built this gaming PC with this, I tested it out with a handful of games so you can get an idea of how it performs. I really didn't put a lot of thought into the games because, well, they were either free games, as in free to play, or free as in I got them free from buying, well, this or the graphic card in there. So I built the PC, benchmarked the games, and didn't really think much about it. So now it's time to do it again, and I want to give you guys an actual apples to apples comparison of how these two systems perform in relation to one another. Because, see, I figured it'd be a while until I was doing things like reviewing sampled GPUs or CPUs. I really hadn't put much thought into standardized benchmarking procedures. Yet, probably self-evident considering I tested the system the first time using 3 games built on the same Unreal 4 engine. So I spent a good part of the week standardizing my testing procedures. Now, in this case, I'm going to use the same games I used the first time, but I'm going to do it more methodically, which is also why I went back and completely benchmarked the Intel system again, which is why this is actually back in there. Now, I do plan on selecting a complete suite of games to more thoroughly test each system, and I'll produce a video on the methodology I use and how I actually benchmark as soon as I get the final suite of games selected, which should be pretty soon. And that's just to provide basic transparency on the process. Second note is that I said I'd benchmark the Ryzen 1600 AF overclocked, and I did, but not using the Wraith Stealth cooler, which was just completely inadequate for anything over 1.3 volts, and I settled on a 4.2 gigahertz at 1.4 volts for overclocking. So for the overclock benchmark, I used this Cooler Master Hyper 212 Evo. Stock benchmark used the stock cooler. And the third note, I got a haircut. But I guess that's not really relevant. So anyway, let's just put up some charts. I think we'll go in alphabetical order today with the game benchmark, so that means we're starting with Apex Legends. Since this is the first chart, let me set it up for you. We're looking at an average and 1% low frames per second at both 1080p, represented by blue bars, and 1440p, the red bars. The resolutions and graphics presets are annotated under the bar graphs, and each is grouped by the CPU that we were testing. Today, that's the Intel Core i3-9100F on the left, the Ryzen 5 1600AF at out-of-the-box settings in the middle, and the same Ryzen 1600AF with a 4.2 GHz all-core overclock, which is 600 MHz over its precision boost clock. For graphics settings, I typically set the highest preset for 1080p, whether that's Epic, Ultra, Highest, or whatever it happens to be called, and the next lowest preset for 1440p. In this case, because Apex Legends is a competitive online shooter, I dialed in custom settings to favor performance and dropped some of the eye candy like shadow detail and impact marks. In these cases, I'm usually aiming for 144 FPS in 1080p and 120 FPS in 1440p. However, for testing purposes, I leave the settings exactly the same for both resolution tests. Again, a lot more on my benchmarking procedures to come. On to the results. We see that there's only a 3 FPS variance in average FPS across all 3 tests at 1080p and just twice that at 1440p, with the Intel chip just squeaking out the lead in both resolutions. Overclocking the Ryzen chip results in marginal improvements to average frame rates, but does provide a 27 improvement to 1% lows at 1080p. Next is Borderlands 3. Not the in-game benchmark, which, well, sucks, but actual gameplay results. Here, the i3 leads in both resolutions by as much as 5% at 1080p, while overclocking the 1600 provides negligible results. Moving on Control, we see, well, a pretty underwhelming group of results, and that's because Control is a very GPU dependent game. CPU usage never really exceeded 50% during gameplay and typically hovered in the 20s and 30s. So this slide doesn't tell us much, except my benchmarking is pretty consistent. Yes. Anyway, let's look at CSGO, Counter-Strike Global Offensive. So, two things. This game is old, yes, but this game is still super popular, and opposed to Control, this game is very CPU intensive. It just wants one fast core, and we see that reflected here. Intel's higher IPC gives it over a 10% performance advantage over the overclocked Ryzen CPU at the same frequency. Another note here are the significant swings between average and 1% lows frame rates, and this is more to do with the game itself than a frame time issue. There are massive FPS swings in the game based on where you are on the map and what's going on. Frame rates significantly drop outdoors with long fields of view, but then spike when you run indoors or look through a scope. Ghost Recon Breakpoint. This is the first of the games where I just ran the in-game benchmark and recorded the results. Mostly it's so you guys watching can hit the same run benchmark button with the same presets and see how it compares. Here we see, well, more cores, more speed, more better, with the overclocked 1600 at about an 11 to 12% advantage over the 9100F. Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order. This game has a really good balance between CPU and GPU utilization, but with the GPU being equal here, the quicker i3 takes the victory by up to 10%. However, I need to mention that despite the latest patch, I'm still seeing stuttering and frame drops between map scenes, which is affecting the 1% lows. The Outer World pretty much mimics the last game, Jedi Fallen Order. It makes sense considering they're both built on the Unreal Engine. Again, I saw a good amount of frame time drop-offs, but without there being a spike on the CPU usage, and 1% lows were all over the place. You can consider the 1% low of 24 in the middle there an outlier. But in any case, it again shows that where the GPU is the same, the quicker CPU has the higher frame rates. Shadow of the Tomb Raider. Standard benchmark. Here, the overclocked 1600 has an up to 7% advantage over the field. Finally, World War Z, another game that is a significant CPU hog at 1080p. Graphical requirements significantly increase with higher resolution, so the CPU has time to process frames while the GPU works at 1440p. Here we see this demonstrated in the 9100F's up to almost 30% FPS boost over the 1600 at 1080p. But when we crank the resolution to 1440p, the difference are all within 3 FPS. Okay, on to the winner. Drum roll, please. Yes. Oh, well, that's all pretty close. So the Intel i3 9100F does pull in front with an average of average frame rates across all games tested of 115 FPS, which is just over 4% higher than the overclocked Ryzen 1600AF. We see some, but not very significant, average FPS gains from overclocking the Ryzen CPU. However, there is up to an 18% improvement in 1% lows, which can result in smoother gameplay. As expected, results even out at 1440p as the work is focused on the GPU, which in this case is the same across all the tests. So that's it, guys. Those results were pretty much on point with what I expected. Now, while multi-core CPUs are becoming more relevant in the gaming PC, almost all games currently on the market will take greater advantage of, first and foremost, a faster GPU, and secondly, a CPU with the faster single core speed, and that means clock speed times IPC. So because the GPU never changed, we saw results based on what CPU could process the physics and AI of each frame the quickest. And we saw these results more prominently at 1080p because the GPU doesn't have to work as hard. It can draw a 2.1 million pixel picture in milliseconds, like single digit milliseconds. The CPU has to process information in the same single digit milliseconds. If it can't do it, the GPU has to wait on it, and that slows our FPS. The quicker the CPU can kick its info up, where everything is, what it's doing, and how it's interacting with everything else, the faster the GPU can draw that picture. Now, when we turn the dial up to 2560 by 1440, we're now asking the GPU to do about 77% more work, drawing the same picture, but now instead of 2.1 million pixels per picture, there are 3.6 million. That takes the GPU a bit longer. Maybe now we're looking at double-digit milliseconds per frame, like low teens. Now the CPU has more time, maybe a billion cycles or more, to complete the same exact calculations. See, no matter how dense or how detailed the picture the GPU needs to draw, the CPU is always giving it the same information: where everything is, what it's doing, and how it's all interacting with everything else. I mean, that's in simple terms, of course, because we're not getting into floating point versus integer calculation. Anyway, I'm getting off script here. Bottom line is, this Intel CPU can process the information and get it to the GPU faster than this Ryzen CPU. At 1080p, that results in faster FPS. This Ryzen CPU can be overclocked to be a little faster in getting the info to the GPU, which results in less stutters at 1080p. At 1440p, it doesn't matter. They're both fast enough for this RX 5700 that neither really has an advantage. So what's my final conclusion or recommendations? Well, I don't really have one. This CPU is $80, this one is $85. This CPU will give you slightly better performance in gaming with current games today. This CPU will probably provide you with, and I hate this word, future-proofing, as more games are taking advantage of multi-core CPUs. This CPU, in my opinion, will provide the better upgrade path for strictly gaming PCs. Because, and I'm sure I'll take flack for this, I still think Intel CPUs are better processors for just gaming. Now, AMD has closed the gap with the 3rd gen Ryzen, but I still think the best price to performance gaming CPU is the i5 9600K. I mean, overclocked to the 5 to 5.1 gigahertz range, it really can't be beat in the sub $200 range, which is where you can find that CPU now. Now, this CPU is better if you're going to game and also do anything else with your PC. You want to stream? This one. You want to do a little content creation, video editing? This one. Upgrade path here is almost infinite, stretching into 2022 with the AM4 socket. It's the little brother of probably the best all-around price to performance CPU on the market today, the Ryzen 5 3600. So that's my conclusion and, well, non-recommendations. Now, I did get several comments about the i3 being a bottleneck, and listen, you can bottleneck any system when any combination of components depending on the game and the settings you use. And it's just simply not really an issue here. I mean, you want to see a bottleneck? I'll show you a bottleneck. But not today. That's a future video. This video is done, and I hope you learned something. I'll leave an updated parts list for this system in both forms in the description below. If you liked what you saw, please hit the like button. And as always, the best way to support a small channel like mine is by subscribing and by, checking out some of my other videos. I mean, I'm halfway to payday, guys. Help me out. I'll be back with a new one next week, so until then, I'm CJ signing off.